Thanks for coming out on this night, rainy, windy, and talk about gender-based violence and violence against women, and I appreciate everybody here. We certainly would like to fill the room a little better. Maybe we'll come up with some ideas to do that. My name is Jeff Ryan. I work for the Barnstable County Sheriff's Office, and it's my pleasure to introduce the Sheriff of Barnstable County, Sheriff Buckley.
Can you hear me? Okay. I'm really happy to be here. It's a difficult night to focus conversation on domestic violence, gender violence, and tragedy. As the sheriff, it's my responsibility to run the jail. And at the Barnstable County Correctional Facility, we see the truth and the tragedy of domestic violence every day. The top charge for leading to incarceration in 2023 is domestic assault. 162 charges of A and B on family members. The next most common charge, 100 charges of assault and battery. The next most common charge is assault and battery with a dangerous weapon. And anecdotally, 90% of those cases, the people know each other. And in a good portion of those cases, there is more than just an acquaintance. What we also see is that men are both the perpetrators and the victims of domestic violence. And the ugly truth is, mostly men are the perpetrators. National studies show that 90% of people who commit violent physical assaults are male. Men perpetrate 95% of all serious domestic violence assaults. 95% of reported assaults on spouses are committed by men against women. And 81% of men who beat their wives watched their fathers beat their mothers or were abused as children. Our staff see the face of that every day. So sometimes men are victims of domestic abuse, and there is domestic abuse in same-sex relationships, but by and large, this problem still looks like it has throughout history. Men hurting women. And it's a behavior that's passed down from generation to generation. If you look back at some of the studies trying to explain where this comes from, what you'll find is that it's primarily a reflection of a patriarchal society and preconceived notions of male and female gender roles. Add a little humor. I know, I listened to it for a year, I don't look like a sheriff. There's a preconceived notion about gender roles. There's a reason I'm only the second female sheriff in the history of Massachusetts. We all grow up in these boxes. As much as we try, we still have boxes where men are strong and dominating and in control, and that boys play with guns and machines, where women are caretakers and gentle and submissive and play with dolls. Try as we might to fight against these stereotypes, they still exist. Our challenge is to continue to remember that these boxes are not real. They are social constructs. Inside the walls today at the jail, we have 20 women. Nearly every one of them has either witnessed domestic violence as a child or has been the victim of domestic violence. National studies show that 70 to 90% of incarcerated women are victims of domestic violence. The 20 women in our facility today have 32 children. That's why this is a generational problem. The sons and the daughters who've witnessed their mothers hurt by an abuser, what message does that send to children? First of all, what we know is they're traumatized by it. Second, it teaches them what it looks like to be male and female. It becomes normalized, and then it becomes part of the next generation. One of the anecdotal things that we talk about, and I haven't been at the jail, I've only been there for 6 years, but Major Anglin's been there in his career for 30 plus years. 25. 30 plus. I'm giving you extra credit. Probably feels like 80. But when you start to see parents and children, and you start to understand what the cycle looks like, I know in the police department you see the same thing. When you first come on the department, you interact with people. And then you keep coming back, and then you start to interact with their family members. So this White Ribbon campaign, this effort to continue this conversation, is an effort to break this cycle. And the challenge and the opportunity to break the cycle rests with men. Women can talk about it all the time. But the stereotype, the box that we need to change, is the male box. The preconceived notions of what's normal and acceptable behavior, primarily between men and women. So tonight is an opportunity to think about how we spread out this conversation. I can say with absolute certainty that the people sitting in this room tonight are part of the solution. And you also have the keys to helping us figure out how we spread this conversation to men and boys who are in the 10th grade, 11th grade, 8th grade. I don't know when kids start dating. But when they start forming those relationships, and maybe it's even younger when we start to set examples of what should be normal behavior between parents. So I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank you for taking the time to start thinking about how we can spread this conversation in Falmouth. And I want to leave you with a couple of uplifting comments. We all know domestic violence is more than the slap across the face. But right now, our laws today only address that. They don't address the insidious, coercive control that accompanies unhealthy relationships. We all see it. I mean, you see it all the time, whether it's someone who's perpetually filing lawsuits in order to control or intimidate a partner, someone who's calling their place of employment, or posting pictures, or making threats. That day-to-day effort to control someone else's behavior is part of the cycle of domestic violence, and thankfully, our legislature has started to recognize that. So there are two pieces of the puzzle. One, well, they both made it to committee, which means they've passed the House and they've passed the Senate. So they're in the committee, and what they attempt to do is add to the definition of domestic violence the pattern of behavior that's intended to threaten, intimidate, harass, control, or coerce a household member. They address isolating household members from friends and family, depriving household members of basic needs, controlling and monitoring household members' activities, finances, and movements, forcing household members to abstain from engaging in specific activities, threatening harm to children or relatives, threatening to commit cruelty to a pet, intentionally damaging household members' property, and threatening to publish sexually explicit images of household members. Everyone in this room has seen that. And everyone in this room understands right now there is nothing we can do about it until that physical violence takes place. So the legislature, following the example of, I think, 5 other states, has stepped forward to adopt and implement coercive control legislation. The one piece where they differ, and this is my own personal editorial here, which to me is the one piece that is the most important, is the difference between the House and the Senate bill is in the House bill, they include litigation, harassing litigation. And in the Senate bill, they don't. What we know is that many times people, men, who are attempting to exercise control over someone, use the court system to do it. They file endless lawsuits related to divorce, related to custody, related to anything they can think of. We get a lot of intelligence on those because we listen to the phone calls at the jail. So we know how insidious that issue is. And what it does is it puts the victim in a situation where financially they can't defend themselves and they can't compete. And people are using the court system as a weapon instead of a way to resolve legitimate disputes. So we will see how that comes out. My own personal opinion is we need to go that far. It's difficult to ask judges to act in that role and determine whether or not something is inappropriate use of the court system. But what we know is that it's really happening and it's causing damage. So with that, I will leave you with that. I will leave you to your session for tonight and look forward through the sheriff's office and personally to working with every effort that we can think of to help change the boxes and help change the conversation. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Sheriff. If I could take a couple of minutes. The sheriff took office a little over a year ago, and she hit the ground running. She said, I want to be involved in the problem of domestic violence and preventing domestic violence. How do we get involved with the White Ribbon Campaign? She got in and said, how do we get involved with human trafficking and how we recognize human trafficking? And she came in running. She said, in my opinion, this is my opinion, as a leading law enforcement official in this region, she wanted to make a mark and make a difference. And what the White Ribbon Campaign is simply a global movement of men and boys trying to end violence against women and girls. Its genesis was apparently one of those massacres, shootings in Canada in the late 80s, prompted a couple of men in Canada to form the group, the White Ribbon Campaign, which was to educate and eliminate this violence against women. Apparently the shooter separated the females and articulated his disgust and shot them down because they were women. And this struck the men to come up with a White Ribbon Campaign. It's a men's problem, and it needs to be resolved by men. In 2007, Jane Doe, which is the coalition of Massachusetts domestic violence and sexual assault survivor services, brought White Ribbon to Massachusetts and invited the men and boys in Massachusetts to be a part of the human rights movement of the White Ribbon Campaign. About 10 years ago, Independence House brought the White Ribbon Campaign down to the Cape and put on events like this yearly. And as I said, the sheriff came in last year and said, we want to be a part of that. And she had staff at the last year's events, and she wanted to sponsor this event, and here we are, and we thank her. It matters to have leaders with influence talk about this problem. Here's what we're going to do tonight, and it's going to be very brief. We're going to show a video. We're going to break out into small groups. I know that kind of makes people feel uncomfortable, but it works. It gets us talking. Maybe we'll learn something. Maybe we'll learn something from each other. Then we'll have a little PSA, the man prayer, and then we'll do the pledge, and we'll be on our way. So, Jason Jackson Cates is from Swampscott. He co-founded the Mentors in Violence Prevention at Northeastern University. You may have heard of it. He works with the military and sports organizations to change attitudes of the males in those organizations and their views on women and violence and masculinity. And he's from, he went to UMass in the 80s. Go Minutemen. Yep. Good play for me. There it is.
I'm going to share with you a paradigm-shifting perspective on the issues of gender violence, sexual assault, domestic violence, relationship abuse, sexual harassment, sexual abuse of children, that whole range of issues that I'll refer to in shorthand as gender violence issues. They've been seen as women's issues that some good men help out with. But I have a problem with that frame, and I don't accept it. I don't see these as women's issues that some good men help out with. In fact, I'm going to argue that these are men's issues, first and foremost. Now, obviously, there are also women's issues, so I appreciate that. But calling gender violence a women's issue is part of the problem for a number of reasons. The first is that it gives men an excuse not to pay attention, right? A lot of men hear the term women's issues and we tend to tune it out and we think, hey, I'm a guy, that's for the girls or that's for the women. And a lot of men literally don't get beyond the first sentence as a result. It's almost like a chip in our brain is activated and the neural pathways take our attention in a different direction when we hear the term women's issues. This is also true, by the way, of the word gender, because a lot of people hear the word gender and they think it means women. So they think that gender issues is synonymous with women's issues. There's some confusion about the term gender. And actually, let me illustrate that confusion by way of analogy. So let's talk for a moment about race. In the US, when we hear the word race, a lot of people think that means African American, Latino, Asian American, Native American, South Asian, Pacific Islander, on and on. A lot of people, when they hear the word sexual orientation, think it means gay, lesbian, bisexual. And a lot of people, when they hear the word gender, think it means women. In each case, the dominant group doesn't get paid attention to, right? As if white people don't have some sort of racial identity or belong to some racial category or construct. As if heterosexual people don't have a sexual orientation. As if men don't have a gender. This is one of the ways that dominant systems maintain and reproduce themselves, which is to say the dominant group is rarely challenged to even think about its dominance, because that's one of the key characteristics of power and privilege, the ability to go unexamined, lacking introspection, and in fact being rendered invisible in large measure in the discourse about issues that are primarily about us. And this is amazing how this works in domestic and sexual violence, how men have been largely erased from so much of the conversation about a subject that is centrally about men. And I'm going to illustrate what I'm talking about by using the old tech. I'm old school on some fundamental regards. I make films and I work with, high tech, but I'm still old school as an educator. And I want to share with you this exercise that illustrates on the sentence structure level how the way that we think, literally the way that we use language, conspires to keep our attention off of men. This is about domestic violence in particular, but you can plug in other analogs. This comes from the work of the feminist linguist Julia Penelope. It starts with a very basic English sentence. John beat Mary. That's a good English sentence. John is the subject, beat is the verb, Mary is the object. Good sentence. Now we're going to move to the second sentence, which says the same thing in the passive voice. Mary was beaten by John, and now a whole lot has happened in one sentence. We've gone from John beat Mary to Mary was beaten by John. We've shifted our focus in one sentence from John to Mary. And you can see John is very close to the end of the sentence, well, close to dropping off the map of our psychic plane. The third sentence, John is dropped, and we have Mary was beaten, and now it's all about Mary. We're not even thinking about John, it's totally focused on Mary. Over the past generation, the term we've used synonymous with beaten is battered, so we have Mary was battered. And the final sentence in this sequence, flowing from the others, is Mary is a battered woman. So now Mary's very identity, Mary is a battered woman, is what was done to her by John in the first instance, but we've demonstrated that John has long ago left the conversation. Now, those of us who work in domestic and sexual violence field know that victim blaming is pervasive in this realm, which is to say blaming the person to whom something was done rather than the person who did it. And we say things like, why do these women go out with these men? Why are they attracted to these men? Why do they keep going back? What was she wearing at that party? Stupid thing, drinking with that group of guys in that hotel room. This is victim blaming, and there are numerous reasons for it, but one of them is that our whole cognitive structure is set up to blame victims. This is all unconscious. Our whole cognitive structure is set up to ask questions about women and women's choices and what they're doing, thinking, and wearing. And I'm not going to shout down people who ask questions about women, okay? It's a legitimate thing to ask. But let's be clear, asking questions about Mary is not going to get us anywhere in terms of preventing violence. We have to ask a different set of questions, and you can see where I'm going with this, right? The questions are not about Mary, they're about John. The questions include things like, why does John beat Mary? Why is domestic violence still a big problem in the United States and all over the world? What's going on? Why do so many men abuse physically, emotionally, and verbally and other ways the women and girls and the men and boys that they claim to love? What's going on with men? Why do so many adult men sexually abuse little girls and little boys? Why is that a common problem in our society and all over the world today? Why? Why do we hear over and over again about new scandals erupting in major institutions like the Catholic Church or the Penn State football program or the Boy Scouts of America, on and on and on, and then local communities all over the country and all the world, right? We hear about it all the time. Sexual abuse of children. What's going on with men? Why do so many men rape women in our society and around the world? Why do so many men rape other men? What is going on with men? And then what is the role of the various institutions in our society that are helping to produce abusive men at pandemic rates? Because this isn't about individual perpetrators. That's a naive way to understanding what is a much deeper and more systematic social problem. You know, the perpetrators aren't these, monsters who crawl out of the swamp and come into town and do their nasty business and then retreat into the darkness. That's a very naive notion, right? Perpetrators are much more normal than that and everyday than that. So the question is, what are we doing here in our society and in the world? What are the roles of the various institutions in helping to produce abusive men? What's the role of religious belief systems, the sports culture, the pornography culture, the family structure, economics and how that intersects, and race and ethnicity and how that intersects? How does all this work? And then once we start making those kind of connections and asking those important and big questions, then we can talk about how can we be transformative? In other words, how can we do something differently? How can we change the practices? How can we change the socialization of boys and the definitions of manhood that lead to these current outcomes? These are the kind of questions that we need to be asking and the kind of work that we need to be doing, but if we're endlessly focused on what women are doing and thinking in relationships or elsewhere, we're not going to get to that piece. Now, I understand that a lot of women who have been trying to speak out about these issues today and yesterday and for years and years often get shouted down for their efforts. They get called nasty names like male basher and man hater and the disgusting and offensive feminazi, right? And you know what all this is about? It's called kill the messenger. It's because the women who are standing up and speaking out for themselves and for other women, as well as for men and boys, it's a statement to them to sit down and shut up. Keep the current system in place because we don't like it when people rock the boat. We don't like it when people challenge our power. You better sit down and shut up, basically. And thank goodness that women haven't done that. Thank goodness that we live in a world where there's so much women's leadership that can counteract that. But one of the powerful roles that men can play in this work is that we can say some things that sometimes women can't say, or better yet, we can be heard saying some things that women often can't be heard saying. Now, I appreciate that's a problem, it's sexism, but it's the truth. And so one of the things that I say to men, and my colleagues and I always say this, is we need more men who have the courage and the strength to start standing up and saying some of this stuff. And standing with women, not against them, pretending that somehow this is a battle between the sexes and other kinds of nonsense. We live in the world together. And by the way, one of the things that really bothers me about some of the rhetoric that against feminists and others who have built the battered women's and rape crisis movements around the world is that somehow, like I said, that they're anti-male. What about all the boys who are profoundly affected in a negative way by what some adult man is doing against their mother, themselves, their sisters? What about all those boys? What about all the young men and boys who have been traumatized by adult men's violence? You know what? The same system that produces men who abuse women produces men who abuse other men. And if we want to talk about male victims, let's talk about male victims. Most male victims of violence are the victims of other men's violence. So that's something that both women and men have in common. We are both victims of men's violence. So we have it in our direct self-interest, not to mention the fact that most men that I know have women and girls that we care deeply about in our families, in our friendship circles, and every other way. So there's so many reasons why we need men to speak out. It seems obvious saying it out loud, doesn't it? Now, the nature of the work that I do and my colleagues do in the sports culture, in the US military, in schools, we pioneered this approach called the bystander approach to gender violence prevention. And I just want to give you the highlights of the bystander approach because it's a big sort of thematic shift, although there's lots of particulars. But the heart of it is, instead of seeing men as perpetrators, women as victims, or women as perpetrators, men as victims, or any combination in there, I'm using the gender binary. I know there's more than men and women. There's more than male and female. And there are women who are perpetrators, and of course there are men who are victims. There's a whole spectrum. But instead of seeing it in the binary fashion, we focus on all of us as what we call bystanders. And a bystander is defined as anybody who is not a perpetrator or a victim in a given situation. So in other words, friends, teammates, colleagues, co-workers, family members, those of us who are not directly involved in a dyad of abuse, but we are embedded in social, family, work, school, and other peer culture relationships with people who might be in that situation. What do we do? How do we speak up? How do we challenge our friends? How do we support our friends? But how do we not remain silent in the face of abuse? Now, when it comes to men and male culture, the goal is to get men who are not abusive to challenge men who are. And when I say abusive, I don't mean just men who are beating women. We're not just saying that a man whose friend is abusing his girlfriend needs to stop the guy at the moment of attack. I mean, that's a naive way of creating a social change. It's along a continuum we're trying to get men to interrupt each other. So for example, if you're a guy and you're in a group of guys playing poker, talking, hanging out, no women present, and another guy says something sexist or degrading or harassing about women, instead of laughing along or pretending you didn't hear it, we need men to say, hey, that's not funny. It could be my sister you're talking about, and could you joke about something else? Or could you talk about something else? I don't appreciate that kind of talk. Just like if you're a white person and another white person makes a racist comment, I hope, that white people would interrupt that racist enactment by a fellow white person. Just like with heterosexism, if you're a heterosexual person and you yourself don't enact harassing or abusive behaviors towards people of varying sexual orientations, if you don't say something in the face of other heterosexual people doing that, then in a sense, isn't your silence a form of consent and complicity? Well, the bystander approach is trying to give people tools to interrupt that process and to speak up and to create a peer culture climate where the abusive behavior will be seen as unacceptable, not just because it's illegal, but because it's wrong and unacceptable in the peer culture. And if we can get to the place where men who act out in sexist ways will lose status, young men and boys who act out in sexist and harassing ways towards girls and women, as well as towards other boys and men, will lose status as a result of it, guess what? We'll see a radical diminution of the abuse.
Excuse me. I've been getting mixed messages about women and violence. I need a little clarification.
Uncle Bill, how am I supposed to grow up to respect women when I have such lousy role models?
Boys are never going to approach you.
Can you help me me to reshape my attitudes towards women?
You need to teach them that violence against women is wrong.
Let's think about what we can do from here out. Not just talking about it. I like the sheriff's idea, and we keep moving forward. Join Men's Action at Independence House. There's a meeting next month. Speak to someone about gender-based violence. That's what they're talking about. That's what Katz is talking about. You know, lean in, intervene. That isn't cool. You know, make it socially unacceptable to treat women like objects. It's something we could strive for. Participate in bystander intervention training. That's what we're talking about. And become more aware of how the media exploits women and encourages violence against women. I mean, that's a whole other 3 hours in the evening to talk about that. How about when we see the women on the newscasts? All the men are in their suits, jackets, vests, it's wintertime, and they have cocktail dresses on with their arms exposed, and they're just telling the weather. What's that all about? Editorializing. The man prayer. Take a listen.
Maya be a man.
一个自信有奉献而生的老人，
שהוא מבין שהפגיעות זה החוזק הגדול שלי.
Idala izikhali, ingazivali.
जो जानने से अधिक सुनने की सराहना करता है,
che cerca la bontà oltre il controllo,
que chora quando a dor é profunda.
A mí fovame, najador.
Puedo apreciar una caricia más que el rendimiento.
die ervaring meer as om uit te kom.
Laat mich langsam bewegen und nicht schnell.
Mogu biti hrabar da odam moj strah i sramotu.
Na nikusanye wanaume wengine wafanye hivyo hivyo.
Que je cesse de prétendre et ouvre toutes mes parties, restées trop longtemps endormies.
May I cherish, respect, and love my mother.
وأترجم صدى الحب ده لمحبة كل النساء والكائنات الحية.
Another powerful piece of media. So, let's take the pledge. If anybody would like to stand and take the pledge, that would be great. And repeat after me. The words are right there. From this day forward, I promise to be part of the solution to ending violence against women and all gender-based violence. Well done. So, some helpful information if you want to make some actions after you leave here. The Men's Action Committee can be reached at that email address. There's a clipboard back there you can put your contact information on. We can send you information about Men's Action. And thank you mostly for coming out tonight. You guys know everybody, you know each other, but you're still here on a rainy Thursday night, and it matters. Thank you. The end.